I just want to say hello and thank you all for making the trek to come here. It has been quite a year in SIG Docs, and I think we have a lot to celebrate and look back on. And I'm also excited for the year to come. I think it'll be a very different year. I hope it's a very different year from what we have done this year. But why don't we get started with an introduction. Let's go over the most important details. The restrooms, if you have not already found them, go out the door, out into the main hall, down to the far end, and they're tucked sort of into the back corner. So let's take just a few minutes to go around, introduce ourselves, and say hello. We've interacted with each other a lot, but we mostly have only seen each other in two-dimensional 300 pixel by 300 pixel boxes. So I wonder if we could go around the room and let's do names, pronouns, and where you are traveling from. So I am Zach Corlison, he, him, they, them. I'm here from the amazingly far distance of Portland, Oregon. Brad? North Carolina, nice.
Steve Perry, he, him, North Seattle. I'm Trent Fozzie, he, him, and I came from grungy city of San Francisco.
Nice.
Hey everyone, I'm Caitlin Barnard, she, her, and I'm from Reno, Nevada.
Thank you.
Joe Heck, he, him, and not even North Seattle just yet.
Andrew Chen, he, him, from Mountain View, down by San Francisco.
Shabby, she, her, originate from Sri Lanka, just moved to San Jose.
Cool.
Cody, he, him, and I'm also from Seattle. Dominic, he, him, San Jose.
Well, thank you.
Jim Angel, he, him, from Austin, Texas.
Jennifer Monroe, she, her, they, them. I'm Washington, D.C., and I'm also the newest state chair. Thank you, Chair.
Yes. Thank you.
Who will be a state institute?
Thank yourself.
Hi, I'm Nazi. I'm from Bangalore, India.
Welcome, Raji. Thank you for making the trip.
Hi, I'm Zach Arnold, he, him, they, them, from Petaluma, California, an hour north of San Francisco.
Excellent. Well, what I would like to do in the time that we have, I'd like to spend about 20 minutes going over what we've accomplished in the past year. I feel like we do a lot, but we have not really had time to kind of catch our breaths and take a moment to celebrate and acknowledge the work that has gone into this past year and what's come out of it. So I'd like to do a little bit of a retrospective. And from there, I would like to move into I've divided our planning time into two parts. The first part, I would like to focus on the year to come for 2019 and think about what is it that we want to be able to say when we meet again next year at this time. What are the goals? What are the things that we want to be able to say we did or that are true of Kubernetes documentation in 1 year? And then the second half of the planning is what specifically are we going to do in the first quarter to get there? How do we divvy that up, and what are the immediate steps that we're going to take? Then we'll have lunch, and after lunch, we'll have some time to do some deep dives. I know that Andrew and Dominic are planning to demo some of their fundamental modeling concept work, and I'm looking forward to that. But if there is a topic that you would like to dive into very specifically in depth, why don't we come back and do that after lunch? So let's start with our retrospective. What did we accomplish in 2018? I can think of a lot of things, but I would like to hear it from the room. What are the things that have stood out to you that we have done this year or that are different this year? Jennifer?
I'm a historian for training, so I'm thinking back to the first thing But it was January. It was in January, and so I kind of wanted to start with that, because I know we're looking at those entry pages now, but I want the room to remember that we did, that user journeys is not even quite a year old as rolled out to the live site, even though we worked on it for some months before
Right.
that.
That it's genuinely surprising to me as well to remember that that was less than a year ago.
Yeah, I think it's really good to start with the beginning of the year, because so much more happened after that.
Yes.
The Hugo migration was a huge.
Yeah.
Right. The idea that we were going to do a Hugo migration didn't exist at the start of this year.
Yep, pretty much.
The Hugo migration started as a conversation, I think in early February, where Andrew and Jared and sort of a small group of folks looked around and said, we need to solve for internationalization. How can we do that? And that went from early February to early May as a thing that started as a concept and was done in execution. So that also is a thing that we did. Brad.
We hosted numerous doc sprints at a variety of conferences.
We have hosted numerous doc sprints at a variety of conferences. Brad, you have led a couple. Andrew, you have also, and Andrew and Jennifer have both led sprints at Write the Docs Portland, at Write the Docs Cincinnati. Brad, you were at Index, IBM Index in February. Andrew helped lead in Copenhagen.
Shanghai, but I wasn't at Copenhagen.
Right. All right, sorry, that was yes. Right. Well, that's why we do this, is so that we can look back and remember the specific things. Right, so numerous doc sprints through the year. How many folks, out of curiosity, how many folks are here because they either heard of or got involved through a doc sprint? Shavi, I think our newest contributor. So.
I want the room to know, Shavi came to Write the Docs Cincinnati from Sri Lanka and gave an absolutely knockout contributing to open source docs talk, and then launched into some really, really like UX critical pull requests against the, well, not just the docs repo, actually the community repo too, because there were CLA issues that she caught. So I want to call it, I
Yep.
really want to shout out
Thank you.
here to really impressive sort of self-onboarding to contributing to Kubernetes generally, and this thing in particular.
Yes. We were very struck by the depth and the vigor of your contribution, Shavi. So thank you again for joining us and for staying with us. So Andrew.
So, related to the internationalization, we have like 3 additional languages up now, Chinese, Korean, and Japanese.
We do. We started the year with a Chinese translation, and in the past year, a Japanese localization project and a Korean project have started as well. I hear, not formally, but informally from Luke Perkins that we may have a German translation within the year as well. Thank you for bringing that up, Andrew. I want to point out how much our localization contributors have contributed, not just to their own localizations, but to SIG Docs as a whole. Like I think about like Jun Yi and Claudia Kang from the Korean team, and how much they have been willing to proof test and fault test internationalization, like the contribution guidelines that we put in place. Their willingness to fault test our branching strategy and point out it was only their willingness to ask some really interesting questions that got us to realize that we did not need to put localizations in different repositories, that we could host them all in one in K website and do that. And I also want to call out the work of Zach Arnold, who, even though we did not implement it, or it was implemented very briefly, but built the Kubernetes docs language labeler to make it possible for us to label localization content to filter. And then I think was it Christoph Blecker came along and said, oh, you can do that natively in Prow. And we were like, why didn't you tell us this? But it was the willingness to build it that made that conversation possible. So Zach, for your, that segues nicely into Release Meister gratitude. So we have onboarded how many? 4 different Release Meisters this year, starting with Jennifer in Q1 for 1.10. And Jennifer, you did a remarkable job considering that we switched midstream from Jekyll to Hugo. So doing one release in one platform and then sort of going, oh, well, I guess we're going to do it this way now, midstream. That earns you, I think, some sort of Grace Under Fire award.
Oh, yeah, well, it's a good thing I work remote, right?
Right. Hello, welcome. This is Tim Fogarty, and just barely missed the introductions, whether accidentally or by design, I don't know. But Tim Fogarty was our 1.13 Release Meister. And you have arrived at the portion where we express gratitude for these things. So thank you very much, Tim, for all of your work in 1.13. So Jennifer, you started out the year with 1.10. Zach, you did 1.12. Yes. Thank you. And I have to confess that it slips my mind momentarily who was our Release Meister for 1.11. Misty. And much gratitude to Misty as well, who has been an invaluable resource of Git knowledge and making our Git game stronger in SIG Docs.
And really helping organizationally with the whole release process and how we need to
Yes.
manage the release contributions.
And Misty is also the reason why we have really rocking contributing docs.
I mean, between Misty and then Zach, it was a really good follow-on. And I mean, I think that every release in 2018, we've seen stronger process put in place.
Yes. Oh, no. Well, I hope we get to see her later. And Jim Angel is going to be our Release Meister for 1.14. So, Jim, thank you.
Listen, just volunteering is enough. And you, I think, have some exposure to understanding why.
So, other things from 2018. Brad.
We started and formalized the wrangling process.
Yes, and credit to that goes for Andrew for having the idea of having a PR wrangler shift to make sure that we were constantly getting PRs, giving pull requests regular attention. So Andrew, I think that's been one of the most successful ideas for preserving our sanity and for preserving the common life of the SIG. So thank you very much. Other things from 2018, Jared.
We actually started doing some long-term planning. We actually had a summit 6 months ago. We sat down and talked about what we wanted
Right.
to do 6 months ago.
We did start to do long-term planning, and
We landed the long-term planning, but we definitely started.
we did. And it's weird to think that that was only 6 months ago, because that seems like a different world. Jennifer.
Andrew and Dominic's modeling project,
Fundamental modeling concepts, yes.
which I think is huge and has the potential to really provide more foundations that we haven't even begun to realize yet for new working the document.
Yeah.
So thanks to both of you for getting that going and continuing to work on it.
We finished getting the blog migrated over from Blogspot or Blogger to GitHub. So Caitlin Barnard is one of our maintainers, and Caitlin is the maintainer for the Kubernetes blog. So I'm so glad that you could make it, Caitlin. And I hope that you are happier working in GitHub than you were in Blogger.
The fact that people can submit their own blog posts now has been a huge improvement.
Nice. Steve, you had your hand up.
We started a couple of subgroups, I don't remember their names, but one is for infrastructure and tooling, and one was for the whole area of the table
Yeah, so we have a couple of working groups now that we did not have at the start of the year. We have tooling. We have docs tooling as its own working group. We have the reference doc generation as its own sub-project. And we started collaborating with SIG Cloud Provider this year in order to start making sense out of the section of the content that's currently labeled setup. We onboarded. Yep, we have lost the screen. There we go. We have onboarded how many new maintainers or how many new approvers this year? If you became an approver this year, raise your hand. Right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 new approvers. And that process has gotten, I think, more and more streamlined over time as we've had to do it more and more intentionally. New contributor guide. We have a really solid new contributor guide this year, thanks largely to Misty Linville, with many iterations on it subsequently, but Misty really carried the water for the new contributor guide.
It's what we have now in the foundation we can continue to build on, which
Yes,
was needed at that point.
absolutely. All right.
One more thing. Neha did that user experience.
Oh, yes. So we had a good comprehensive UX study by Neha, the Google intern, that gave us some really actionable feedback to implement for content. And we'll come back to content when we get into planning, because out of all these, this is a really remarkable list of achievements over the past year, but there are some missing pieces, and it's those missing pieces that I'd like to address when we get to planning. So is there anything else that folks want to call out about our work over this past year before we move on to planning? Jennifer.
Something I want to take into planning also, this is why I'm calling it out here. This actually started in 2017, but we continue to build on it in 2018 in some important ways, and that's wrangling the release notes process.
Better release note wrangling. I know that Jennifer, you and Nick Chase have done some really valuable work in getting that process close to something close to reasonable and repeatable. Zach?
I apologize if this is a dumb question, but is that part of SIG Docs?
The release notes process?
It, like I said, I brought it up because I think we need to discuss it in planning. It became part of SIG Docs with the 1.8 and it's kind of drifted, and it stayed that way through like 1.9, 1.10, and it's kind of drifted away. So I'd like to, sorry, I'm trying not to cross the streams here, but
Exclusively SIG release. Just because like there's a process in the PR that says release note and then there's a block and there's a way to automatically scrape it out and add it to the list.
yes, all of that, and let's come back.
Yeah, we'll come back to it.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's
I'm really glad you asked the question.
right. But let's please discuss that as part of our planning is the degree to which we own the release notes process, and what we'd like to see be true of release notes in 1 year. One more thing I want to call out before we move to planning, and that's Andrew did a lot of work with site analytics so that we have decent site analytics and we actually have a sense of what we're able to look at specific metrics for site traffic, page landings, and things like that, and get real value and real feedback based on site analytics, and that is largely at Andrew's initiative that those conversations happened. So that's sort of below the surface. It's not really high visibility, but it's very valuable, and it's guiding, I think, some of the content planning that I hope we're going to look at for the year to come. So Andrew, thank you for that work.
We also have like a site performance and SEO kind of audits. We based on those too.
Yes. All right. So let's take a look at these things. This is a pretty meaty list of accomplishments for 2018. And this is all due thanks to the work of folks and contributors in this room. So I would like for everyone to look around at the amazing people that you're sitting here with and give each other a hand. So let's move on now to planning. I don't know how well this is going to work with me standing up here, but let's give it a try. So one of the things that we talked about when we met at the SIG Docs Summit 6 months ago in Portland was what we wanted to say was true in 6 months. I don't know that we really got that well defined at the summit, frankly. I think it was just sort of us getting together and saying, yes, is this a thing? It's a thing. This is good. And that was a good start. But so I mentioned earlier a missing piece in our accomplishments for this year. And that is, I think, specifically around content. We have been working, Jared said this to me, we have been working at the edges of our core competencies as people who work in tech docs. We have been working out rather than at the heart of content and ensure that making content and the documentation itself as clear and as valuable and as concise as possible. We've been solving technical debt. We've been working through process. But in this list, there's not a whole lot that we can point to specifically in terms of content and say our setup, our getting started page is better than it ever has been. Our developer onboarding, our API reference are better than they ever have been. And so I want to start our conversation there with content for the coming year. I would like to honor the work that we've done, but I would like for us as a SIG to think about refocusing on content for 2019 and looking at the heart of Kubernetes documentation and figuring out what are the pieces that we need to work on. What are the things that we want to be able to say are true of our content in 2019? So I guess to begin with, does that seem reasonable to folks? Do folks agree with that assessment? Is anybody who's like, no, you're crazy, this is completely different? So any concurrence, people who want to add to that? So that is an excellent question. Raji is asking how we want to approach accessibility for our content in this coming year. And accessibility, it straddles the line between process and content, but I think that it's really worthwhile to discuss and to approach. So we can't make assumptions about how people are coming to our material or the challenges, that the way that we present our content is as equally accessible for everyone. So there are some things that we can do with accessibility to make our content easier for a wider audience to consume. So I would say so, yes. Jennifer.
Worth calling out accessibility as a separate item, though, and understanding that it, in a matrix sort of way, touches on other issues. Because I can see us wanting to provide, sort of better guidelines, both for writing and for presenting content. That's two different things, right? Site UX also is kind of, matrixed in that way, right?
It might be best just like toss all of our ideas that.
Yeah, it's kind of, and then we can figure out where they map, how they map to each other.
Right.
I think we're good. I mean, accessibility is really important, and I think the question about how it relates to content is important.
Sure.
Maybe we'll consider that separately.
Yeah, so this is, I've put some seeds in here to start the discussion, but this is by no means like a definitive list. So what else should we be focusing on? What are the other ideas that folks have? Jennifer, then Jim, then Steve. Jennifer.
I have a question.
Yeah.
And maybe this belongs in
That's fair. That's kind of hand wavy. So
I can define it in, 10 different ways that are all applicable, but some of them more doable than others.
sure. I would say let's note that, and then let's come back to that, because it's absolutely worth exploring that, like talking about what we actually mean when we say dev onboarding. Jim.
It's a great transition to what I was going to bring up. It's a little bit selfish because it's what's right in front of me, but the release playbook for the release lead and also the release team shadow. It's almost like a sub-item on onboarding new devs. It's that release playbook that you talked about and I talked about for upcoming release cycles. And I think there could be a pretty informal retro after a release cycle. What went well, what didn't go well, then that's in one central location instead of 1,000 different gists.
Right. And specific, you mean that specifically for docs, right?
Correct, yeah.
Because that winds up as part of the retro, the bigger retro, but then docs is really its own critter for the release.
So can we put that?
Outside the release.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, outside the release retro, like what you were saying is that it would be focused on the release meister and the release shadows for what went well and what didn't go well.
So could we put that under a broader umbrella of like contributor docs, like contributor experience? Making sure that we continue to, contributor docs continue to get love, and that's a specific place where the contributor experience needs to be better.
Yeah, I think if you
Yeah,
should
but
obtain the
release
release
meister's a whole, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think we're saying the same
We
thing.
are. I think it needs to get called out at a higher level, the release doc, the docs role for the release. Because it's its own very special kind of contributor one.
Sure, it is a very specialized role, but it's also a very critical one.
Which is why I think we need to call it, yes, thank you.
And I want to call out that in the release just passed in 1.13, Jim's solved a problem that had recurred from an earlier release. It was fixed in an earlier release, never made its way to master, and then we had to solve it all again and try to dredge up the lore of how we solved it the first time. But Jim has ensured that that won't happen again, that particular issue.
Officially in master now.
Yes. So making sure that we have a comprehensive release playbook for release meisters. Welcome, hello. Other things to Steve, yes.
I'd like to add an intermediate to concept, so explaining basic and intermediate level concepts better, and also improving and expanding tasks. I think we can kind of leave tutorials alone this year, but I'd like to see concepts and tasks both.
So specifically, Steve is saying add an intermediate designator for concepts.
Not a designator, but I just want us to not limit ourselves to basic content. I think we need to
Okay.
also expand the concept topics that we write for intermediate level readers.
Okay. So expanding our concept documentation to include deeper material, and building out our task content more as well. Other hands? Other things other ways that we would like to see our content grow or change in 2019? Shavi. So like better documentation within the admin pathway. So okay, better admin docs, and she specifically mentioned like better CLI docs. Okay, that's good feedback. Thank you. Just at the contributor summit last night, I talked to a couple of devs who came up specifically to say thank you for the docs. So your work is very much appreciated. It is very helpful, and folks are finding value and use in our documentation. So I just wanted to share that out and make sure that, yes, we're going to talk a lot about ways in which our documentation is missing today, but it's still helpful and people love it. So carry that with you. Brad, had you raised your hand? Excellent.
I'm really liking the 2019 plan.
Good deal. So other things that we'd like to focus on in 2019. Andrew.
I don't know about focusing on, but like, you know, when Phil at the last SIG Docs meeting, right, was introducing the queue control documentation, like,
Yep.
made me think we need to make some decisions about like meta, like information architecture, like what should be on our site, like how, you know, how do we connect all the things that are in the documentation ecosystem, you know?
And this is where things can get difficult because in some ways you can separate out the system content from information architecture, and then it's multi-task, right? And I think that there's a risk in addressing the meta issues and the information architecture issues. There's a risk that we start working at a level of abstraction where we depart from the content. This is maybe more into the next section, but I think we're at the point where we have to look, you know, sort of carefully and hard at exactly that issue. And we've all agreed that we want to focus on content. So make sure that we make a plan for, you know, sort of redesigning information architecture if we're going to consider that as part of content rework in a way that we don't get bogged down in it, that we're facilitating better content, you know, the actual improvement of topics, writing new topics, addressing audiences appropriately, getting that intermediate content in, so that we're not, I don't know about the rest of you. I can go into system design in a heartbeat, and then it's like, and at a certain point I need to dive back into the details because I can't tell whether the design is working. But I would hate to see the group kind of get bogged down in the design phase.
Sure.
I just want to call that.
I think that's a great point. I think defining sort of what we focus our energy on when it comes to these sort of larger meta projects and how we interact with them.
Yep. Yeah, and this
What's our
specific one,
API for?
because, I mean, I absolutely agree with Andrew. You know, we've got to a point where it's quite possible that the current overall architecture of the site isn't serving the content needs that we see as well as it could. But, you know, can we come up with short-term, easy to iterate on solutions to pieces of problems that we see that don't work?
So this is starting to segue nicely. So I will add one more piece to like specific areas of content. I want you to know how many meetings with Jared and with Chris that I have sat, thankfully not literal, but metaphorical tears streaming down my cheeks that after a year, our setup page has still not meaningfully changed. So I would love to get to the setup page and make that as meaningful, as helpful, and as sensible as possible. That we take what is currently called setup in the documentation and get that into a true getting started section. And I will basically, like, I will hide bodies at this point if it means that we actually get to do that this year. That 1 year from now we say we have a true getting startup section. But that does segue nicely into not only questions of specific pieces of content, but how we present our content. So Jennifer, you raised a nice discussion. So to go back earlier to user journeys being less than a year old, I think that to summarize the discussion about user journeys that we've had over the past year, that user journeys have been an excellent test, and it's time to iterate upon them. So I know that, Andrew, you have a PR in the works about changing our landing page design away from user journeys and more to a card design. But I also know that your responsibilities and the scope of your work may be changing. So how easy would that be for someone else to pick up and run with, that redesign PR that you have in progress?
Yeah, I think they just need to learn like the
Sure.
But like, yeah, if we, Cody started on some mock-ups and stuff, so we could use that as guidance for like, you know, how to implement it. It's not, conceptually, it's not that hard, right? Because Jared showed me like the TensorFlow tutorial page, and that's kind of what it would be modeled after, where you just collapse all the stuff into these cards where you'd have like a list of links, and so we would have one that's like getting started, and then quick go into that section, and that sort of thing.
Cool. So let's talk about that more in the next part. Brad.
Well, I had a question, I can't remember how far we got, but it's related to the setup. So if you look at the setup, there's a picking the right solution that lists all 60 or whatever the different options, which is great. But then we've got the panel on the side, and then if you click the twisties, there's only a few on each side. Was that, do we have a plan to kind of align those?
No, but hopefully we will over the next hour. So another piece of, I guess, our information, our meta process that I'd like to see is we've talked over the past year about how to ensure that content is always fresh. And I think that a piece of that may be figuring out how to stale out content, how to ensure that if content has not received an update in the past year, that it is staled, meaning that it will eventually drop, or that it flags owners, or does something. But getting some kind of automation in place to ensure that content that has not received review or any sort of PR or update to it within a certain amount of time is flagged for some sort of review. Andrew, Jennifer.
Well, I was just going to say, I know this is something some of the other SIGs care deeply about as well. So I think this could be one place where we've got a really nice sort of cross-SIG. We could, you know, develop right from automation, really develop some nice cross-SIG.
That is a good point. We don't have to develop this in isolation. That this is an excellent opportunity to collaborate with other SIGs who are also facing the same problem, or the same question of how to do this, what a specific implementation could look like. Andrew?
Yeah, so related to that, I was talking to Tim Hawken and sort of evolved into thinking about it in terms of like the content life cycle, not just freshness, but like make sure we have content like created for, you know, new things, and then make sure it's updated in terms when the whatever like feature, for example, is moving from, you know, beta to GA, that sort of, and then like yeah, and then also being able to remove content when it's no longer relevant or you know.
And I mean, the issue that the SIG cluster lifecycle specifically brought to me is the issue of, are we documenting content for alpha features appropriately? Maybe we're not.
That's fair.
Right. There's a whole content lifecycle
Sure.
question.
So in the interest of time, I want to note that it is 11:01. We have just under an hour until lunch. So I'm going to start moderating our discussion a little more actively to make sure that we get where we need to go in the next 60 minutes. So this is what we're looking at. We're looking at onboarding new devs, a little hand wavy still, but onboarding new devs, explaining basic and intermediate concepts better, expanding the tasks documentation, turning the setup into getting started, defining and documenting the release process, better CLI and admin documentation, what we're going to call meta information architecture, some of the questions about how we do what we do with content, content freshness, I would lump that into meta information architecture, site UX and accessibility. This is a lovely list of accomplishments. Do we think that we can do all of these in 2019? Yeah, go for it. I think that we can, but Zach.
So, I think one of the things that I've noticed in our contribution, kind of just as I've lazily been checking the PR queue, is of all of the SIGs, I think we have the most diverse set of contributors, because you don't have to know Go and have read 53 million lines worth of source code to understand how to get something in appropriately into our code base. You have to know a language and a format
one has to see it, like that brow or whatever, tie, spot,
I thought about this.
oh.
I think there needs to at least be a peer review process. I have seen things that, I have seen one like yours that,
Well, they're like drive-by PRs. Someone who's never gonna do the like, they probably won't contribute again, and then just like, hey, so this spelled, here you go. Sign the CLA, but, you know, just probably wouldn't do much else.
I mean, I think this is like one level up. Like,
Okay.
I think there should be a tier of PRs where it's like this is a large PR and it gets this level.
So Jared, are you suggesting that we revamp our review process?
I realize that I'm actually trying to solve this problem instead of actually thinking about the higher level issue. But I do think this, yeah, revamping the review process.
Okay.
Does everybody mind if I close the door? And
I would love it if, thank you very much.
I had trouble hearing what you were saying, Jared, and it sounded like important. Because this concerns me too.
I think Zach identified a case.
Right.
And I think there's like a general case where there's like very, very small PRs that can do like a very quick review. And then there's much more.
Yep,
Right.
yep, yep.
So Brad, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess, and I go back to what was originally Joe Peck's sort of guidelines on how to do PR wrangling. I mean, what I viewed those really quick and easy ones as the ones that as the PR wrangler, you could just very quickly as yourself slash LGTM and then slash approve and be done. So I was always looking at it as a role of the PR wrangler because at the same time, anytime I did that, I would go look at the preview just to make sure, even though it looked like it was, I changed the letter here or added an S. I felt really uncomfortable just pushing that through without looking at, because maybe something was hidden that I didn't notice, and
Yep.
then it messes up the formatting. But I really kind of thought that we were handling that very well, just as a minor role of the PR wrangler. Did not other people not feel that way?
I'm right with you, Brad. I found I actually find those PRs useful because when I've got, you know, like 2 or 3 big ones I need to pay a lot of attention to, if there's a lot of back and forth with technical comments, and I'm trying, you know, typically this is going to be a PR where I need to worry about like making sure new content is clear and everything really actually works the way it's supposed to. I need to spend a lot more time on that PR. I can't do very many of those. I do have a day job, even though the day job is
So-
part of to do part of this.
In the interest of speeding the discussion along, let's put, can we summarize this as review our review process? I will say that I think Zach holds the record for most PRs closed as a PR wrangler. And the way that you explained it to me is that at the time is that you had simply adopted Misty's process, where you pass it through the sieve of filter by extra small. We can discuss the particulars of that. Yeah, we can discuss the particulars of that in Slack or in the working group devoted to that. But I'd like to get specific. I'd like to move to part 2 now and talk about what specifically are we going to do in Q1. Sorry, let's back up one step and say, does this look like a reasonable list of things to accomplish? Hi, I'm sorry, I don't recognize you. I don't know your name. I'm Zach. Hi.
Oh, no, this, so,
Oh, it's Chris. Hi.
yeah, hi. There's some lights. So, I know that, like, I volunteered to do some of the work before, and I've dropped the ball on that. And I think that one thing that would help me reach these goals is if we actually set, like hard tasks and deadlines, because part of it is as a part-time contributor and not someone deeply, not deeply invested in docs as you might be as a full-time person on this. Knowing that I have a thing to do and a deadline to do it by, and on a specific task, I think that would help people like myself to say that, oh, this week's coming up and I actually need to produce something for the team to see.
So like more structure around larger contribution pieces?
Yeah, a little more structure about around the larger goals that we have here that we've also identified as incredibly important.
Awesome. That's good feedback. Thank you. Andrew.
Well, so related to that, then maybe we can use the SIG Docs meeting as the deadline. Like it has to be done by this SIG Docs meeting date, and then when it's done, then they can do a quick update and present to the.
That seems like fairly reasonable to use the to set milestones in the meeting, in the weekly meeting, and then review them, like as time goes by. I think that there's maybe some discussion piece around what those milestones should be that can happen outside of the context of the meeting. But using the meeting as like a milestone check-in time seems like a reasonable use of time. But yeah, let's dive into that. But I still want to get consensus on, does this look like a reasonable list of things that we should focus on? Is this reasonably complete? Is there anything that's missing from here? Is there anything that shouldn't be on here?
I think it's good, and I don't think you want it any bigger.
So it seems about the right size. Do folks agree? Yes? No? All right. I agree. This looks like it looks substantial, and it looks that we can get specific enough to actually accomplish this over the course of the year. So let's talk about this first quarter, January through March. What do we want to focus on first? And this is where it's going to get difficult because all of these things matter and are tremendously important. What should we focus on first, and what can we reasonably expect to accomplish?
I'll throw out a first candidate, setup.
So setup, the setup,
Setup to getting started.
right? The setup to getting started section.
Can I say a little more about why I think it's a good one? Speculate. Speculate.
Thank you, Jim.
I would throw in there the defining document release docs process as the release of 114 being in Q1. I think that that's going to be one of my actions.
So better release contribution docs. Other things that we should focus on in Q1. Andrew.
I think working out the user journeys and redoing the docs homepage, I think can be done in Q1.
So revamping the homepage UX from user journeys to the card-based template in Q1.
That should set things up for the rework of like the getting started in another section.
That was my next question.
So Steve. Oh, sorry, Steve then Jared.
Yeah, in Q1, let's figure out what we're going to do with Phil Whitrock's proposal, because that's part of getting the CLI and the admin documentation in place. And I think in one quarter, we should be able to, come to a decision and have that in place.
So implementing the Phil Whitrock's contribution to admin docs.
Yeah, and the decision may be that we do nothing with that except link to a book that he maintains elsewhere. The decision might be we want to hold
Right.
that in, but let's have that decision made and have something, let's start of it in place by the end of Q1.
Okay. So at least figuring out what we want to do with that. Okay, Jared.
It seems like instead of getting started and redoing user journeys, both part of onboarding,
I would say so. So let's dive into what we mean specifically when we talk about onboarding new developers. So I'm going to take a stab at this and hopefully land somewhere in the 60% range of accuracy. I would say that onboarding new developers means that when someone comes to Kubernetes.io, the first thing that they find is how to get started and what is Kubernetes. And what are the various APIs and how do I use them? So 3 pieces. What is it? How do I start using it? And what are the APIs? Andrew.
So we're talking about application developers, right? Because this easily gets conflated when people are talking about like code contributor developers, and I want to just make sure that we keep them separate.
That is fair. Tim.
Also, do we want to focus on getting started content for administrators?
For administrators. So that was one of the specific pieces that Xavi mentioned, had heard feedback asking for. So when you think about like what are the most important things that an admin needs when they land on Kubernetes.io? What are the first things that an admin needs to see? How to set up a cluster.
Basic administration tasks, securing, namespacing.
Security is actually hugely important. I don't know if you all saw the report that came out a few days ago about the worldwide collection of unsecured Kubernetes clusters.
Oofda.
That's huge on my thing too. This is probably not a shameless plug, but we were, after our security talk in May at the previous KubeCon, we were contracted to start making a book on Kubernetes security. And unfortunately now like it's turned on full fire on us. And we're kind of just like, hey, we'd rather just give the information to the people who need it and do it now. So how do we make security like a default setting in Kubernetes? Or at least for operators that are administrators, like Tim was saying, give security as a default or something that's really easy to configure.
Sure. And I would focus that in SIG Docs specifically to how do we make that information available and like easily discoverable. Jared?
Jeff mentioned this earlier on release notes, but I wish we had like a security bulletin section.
Yeah.
Oh, that would be really nice, wouldn't it?
CVEs related to.
Yeah,
Well-
we had similar issues with Inspector helped out a lot of those issues with group cloud side. We just had to create a whole process in Fire.
So I'm looking at the planning, onboarding new devs. Do we want to say, sorry. Right.
Well, I wanted to piggyback on that because I think there are pieces of Kubernetes development in place now. I mean, specifically the security group, right? That's also new in 2018. It's not SIG Docs related, but there are security efforts in place with Kubernetes itself that I think you can piggyback on to produce that. I mean, yes, I can look at it places to work cross-functionally, but I would think that doing it, that providing that security bulletin, not just as part of release notes, but sort of whenever needed, might be a really, like, hugely important thing we do. And I realize this is a new thing, but oh my God.
Sure.
So
So I agree that this is really important, and I also want to point out that this is a place where cross-SIG collaboration is not only good but necessary.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Like with not steering, SIG architecture specifically. There is, I don't know if it's an actual SIG, but there is a group out of architecture that is devoted to security, and there is, it's not well exposed, I think intentionally so, but there is a pathway for reporting security vulnerabilities.
Which is itself appropriately secured, but at a certain
Right.
point that information needs to get out.
Right. So that's an opportunity to work with the security folks to make sure that we are surfacing security concerns in a way that matches their standards and matches best practices. But yes, but including that intentionally in our release bulletin or our release note process.
Back to Zach's now temporarily absent original point, I think we need to be there's like security issues that we can help document in the moment and as part of release notes if that's the right.
Sure. So I think the buy-in is there, but I'm going to pull us back to the top to talk about focusing on things for January to March.
Right. Well, I just wanted to add, I think it's real important to distinguish that between that kind of doc work and documenting security best practices, using the security tools that exist in Kubernetes. Those are two different things.
Yes. Yeah, because one is a layer of process around contribution reporting, and the other is actual, how do I do this? How do I secure a cluster? Okay. I think Jim and then Brad.
Real quick on the admins, and hope I'm not getting too into the weeds here on Steve's comment on setting up a cluster, but I'm more operational than a developer, and when I was learning Kubernetes, I think understanding should be the first step. Then setting up, because the landscape's so giant, so understand the landscape and understand the technology, then setting up a cluster, maybe
see onboarding for admins parallel to onboarding for devs because I think it's its own.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And under onboarding for admins, basic understanding, setting up a cluster, and at that point we'll have to decide what becomes intermediate level. But I think at least those two things are onboarding for admins.
Brad, did you?
No, mine was just a little housekeeping issue. You initially started with you said, when I think about the onboarding new section, there's three things that came to mind. One was you tell them what is Kubernetes, and then two others.
How to get started,
How to get started.
and API reference.
And API reference. I just want to make sure those got captured.
Sure, thank you.
I guess I'm wondering if how to secure a cluster is under onboarding an admin. It seems like the next level up from onboarding an admin. But then we can
Sure.
talk about
So that's, I think that's a good like meta architecture question. Is about what are the common tasks between developers and admins, or like cluster admins and app developers. Talking about what are the common tasks, and then where do they meaningfully branch? That's something that I think that user journeys captured well in its essence. I think that's an implementation thing that we can iterate on for like a card-based design. But if we I'm trying to think about how to turn this into like a meaningfully specific task for Q1 that we can say we met this or we're still working on it. Do we want to? Yes, Steve.
So we're thinking of having pointing to something very concrete that is getting started, right?
Yes.
So I could see having two buttons, one for getting started for application developers. Yeah, and so we have a section for that. And as a concrete goal, we could have one or two topics in that section completed. Same for admins. Maybe a different button for getting started for admins. Same thing, put that section in place, one or two topics in place.
Is there common ground that underpins both of those? Sections? Do you think?
They could probably point to the same conceptual topic. What are the basic concepts you need to understand about Kubernetes? So that topic could probably be common material.
Okay, so identifying common material and then building out, shall we say, at least two topics in admin and in the admin path and in the developer path.
Yeah, and then getting up front the buttons easy to see.
So in our transition from user journeys to iterative site UX, making sure that there is a clear differentiation in the journey between admins and operators and the common material that they share.
I think so. What do you think, Andrew? Is that a good idea to right away divide between
Well, so
admin
what
and
I learned from the UX day was that there is this common core, sorry, Zach, the common core that they'll learn before they start differentiating. So we could have, the getting started card, but then have two separate cards for the developers and the admin, right? And then, because it's more about just threading them through the existing docs. We don't have to create necessarily a whole new section, but give them sort of a list of the documentation that is relevant to them so they can quickly go through and click to go to those things.
Sure. Zach.
You covered it.
Awesome. So I hear us saying the same thing. Let's see. So Jennifer, is that adequately specific for defining onboarding new developers, or can we even just back that up and say not just developers but admins onboarding? Can we summarize that? Is that sufficient depth to talk about onboarding, or do we need to get more specific?
I think there's one more thing that belongs here and elsewhere too. Right? And this is kind of in response to saying that we shouldn't be linking to existing content, but I think at the same time, we want to be doing an ongoing audit of where we need to rewrite stuff so that it's not so damn feature driven, and it's actually more UX driven.
Yeah, I'll second that, but when I was working on the user journey stuff early on, there was a tremendous pain in using the existing content because it really kind of needed to be refactored to
Yeah.
an extent. It needed to be reset so that you could use it that way.
So-
Today isn't in the waiting to do that.
Right.
So how would we define that as specific things to accomplish in Q1? What are the first steps that we need to be able to take? So if the end goal is at the end of the year being able to say our docs are actually UX driven and that things are meaningfully parsed out, what are the first steps that we take in Q1 to get there?
I
And-
would shorthand it by calling it iterative content audit, so that in addition to leveraging existing content, we're sort of, we're writing issues. I mean, let's figure out ways to manage those issues so that we don't lose track of them too, right? But where we've got a pathway that we want to take users through, and we need to link out to content that's really not going to help
Sure.
them the way we think they need help, sort of don't let that become a roadblock.
Sure.
But do the work of auditing it to figure out what needs to be fixed.
So I think that an iterative, sorry, just one second. I think an iterative audit sounds like a great specific end of year goal. Do folks agree that that is what we need to focus on in Q1?
I mean, it's an implementation thing. It's not a.
Sure.
It's really a sort of wherever you're working on.
Andrew.
I think coming up with a plan would be the action item for Q1, right? Because so for example, for the operator thing, you want to figure out what the life cycle thing is and what are all the pieces we need to give them, and then evaluate whether the existing content does that or not. If it doesn't, then rewrite that.
I think that's also a good time, a good opportunity to pull across SIGs and find out who else is trying to manage the life cycle of content, and at least surface that we're doing this to other SIGs and get their feedback as well. Zach.
If you're talking about iterative auditing, would this be a task we could chuck at the release meister?
Oh, that's an interesting question.
That is like a guaranteed quarterly review of user journeys. Of hey, with the latest 114 changes, actually, you don't even need the whiz-bang manifest anymore because we've automated that out. And now Kubernetes can make ice cream. So
That's a good idea. Just at least have that person in on it.
Sure. And that sounds like an opportunity to work with the overall release manager. Like in picking out the new themes of a release. That I know from a release manager standpoint that tends to happen later in the cycle, but that is a good opportunity to coordinate, to look at the specific doc's impact
the only reason
overall.
I say that is because it seemed like it was fortunate that I'd had at least a few hours worth of running a cluster to know oh, hey, that's actually super important. We need to make sure that this gets explained more. For
Sure.
example, switching DNS providers. I was oh, okay, that's going to be big for some people. I mean, the underlying mechanism.
Sure.
Anyway, so it might be worth also having somebody, because I know that not all of us have cluster operation experience. It might be worth having just a quick meeting with the release manager and Docs lead and somebody who could translate if necessary. And everybody would be smart, if necessary, and be hey, this is more important than we think it is, so there should be more emphasis on different syllables of this documentation.
Sure. So, one second, Andrew. We have about 30 minutes left, so I want to make sure that we fill out the things that we are going to do in Q1. Jared.
Process question and suggestion. Can we actually reach these high level bullets once we say once we agree on that? Can we have that? Can we have an owner for it?
So fill out the top level bullets first, find an owner,
Yes.
and go from there.
Definitely getting into how are we going to
Right, and this is really good, but it's at cross purposes to filling out the list. Sure. Okay. Andrew.
I was just going to say, for completeness, we should add 1.14 to this list, because it will eat up some time, and then we can also list the
Yes.
that are related to it.
That is, that's a good point, is that we have ongoing work as well. There's also routine administration, like I need to build out the PR wrangling schedule for like the next 6 months. So like all of the routine maintenance that goes into making the SIG run. So better onboarding, the 1.14 release process, making a specific decision around Philip Whitrock's kube control docs. What else do we want to focus on in Q1? We have some specifics from improving a docs process. We have accessibility. Let's see. Better security documentation and bulletins. Let's see. Andrew, you mentioned that like better UX is like doable in a quarter. Do you want to, out of what we have not yet covered, what else do we want to cover in Q1? I'm going to vote for accessibility. I would say let's at least get started on it. If we're going to start assigning owners to stuff, Raji, do you want to own accessibility in Q1? Sure. Is it reasonable to say, like, if we could aim for an overview of what needs to happen with accessibility, like in March, would you be willing to give like a presentation about this is the definition of accessibility, and these are the specific things that we need to do to make the site more accessible? Is that something that you would be willing to do? Okay, excellent. Thank you, Zach.
Just because I don't know, like, what is our working definition of accessibility?
Raji, do you want to define accessibility briefly? Can you do it in like 30 seconds? Things like font choices, like legibility, making dyslexia-friendly fonts, making sure that people who use adaptive listening devices that are like text readers, that our text is optimized for being spoken by a reader.
One place that information is gathered is Section 508. That's US-centric, but Section 508 compliance is one standard definition of accessibility.
Sure. Okay, so let's see.
I'll work on defining the content plan.
On defining the, I'm sorry?
Define the content.
Oh, define the content plan for onboarding. Thank you, Steve. Let's see. I will take on the better documentation for the release docs process. There are some particular, unless Jim, you feel strongly about wanting to own that.
I'm happy sharing ownership. Cody and I are shadowing.
Awesome. Okay, then we'll say like Jim, Jared, and Cody, if you want to work on the 1.14 release or the release playbook. Yeah, you've been voluntold.
I think for this, more the merrier. There's so many different thoughts and different processes and approaches to do things.
Sure.
I don't have all the answers. I don't think anyone here has all the answers, but together I think we can get a great start. So.
Right.
I have a question.
Yes.
Because the release notes question hasn't shown up in this doc. And I don't know whether we want to find a place for it now. We're okay. But I don't want to find it.
I think that was my bad.
So do we want to?
Right. I think I'm trying not to commit to anything.
Right. So in the absence of a clear yes, what happens if we postpone it to Q2? Does disaster occur?
Yes, and, should Q1 transpire differently, I'll take it on to Q1. But let's put it off to Q2.
Okay.
I would, if we can find time, maybe I could take 10 minutes during the deep dive session this afternoon to talk about the history of SIG Docs of your instance. Because it sounds like most of the room isn't familiar with it.
That sounds perfect. Yeah, it's opaque to me as well, so I would love to. We'll add like 10 minutes in the deep dive to talk about release notes. Other things that let's see, accessibility, Raji. So for the setup to getting started, that I would love to take that on. For political reasons, I need to be a part of whatever happens there. And by political reasons, I mean it's probably not a good idea for one cloud provider to edit another cloud provider's description of themselves. I'm sorry?
It's only one piece of it.
Right. So changing the setup to getting started is.
Cloud providers happy to be an intermediary for that also, because that's the kind of also our responsibility.
Excellent.
Me for anything that needs to happen on that, I can bring it up at our weekly meetings.
You've done related work there. Are you willing to be part of a small working group?
I'm happy to. It was just what I was trying to do before. There was a lot of trench work. If I have more people like.
I just said I was trying not to commit for Q1, but I care passionately about that, and probably as far as other non-cloud provider content, I've spent more time there than anybody else.
Sure.
In the room.
So.
If Chris and Cody are both willing to sort of.
I mean, if I have marching orders, I'll go to the SIG Cloud provider meeting and every week just say.
Okay.
And I think Cody's got some good notions about architecture.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, then I'm happy to take the lead on it with that kind of resource.
That sounds excellent, and I'm happy to, to continue to be involved. And I'm sorry.
That leaves room for an appropriate role for you.
Excellent, Brad.
I don't mind leading or working on the what is K8's overview. I enjoy doing that.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I hear that you published a book about that. So, Brad, if you want to take on the what is Kubernetes, that overview. Andrew?
Can I join that group?
Absolutely. I think that would be a great place to talk about modeling as well.
I didn't want to be alone.
Yeah. So, Andrew and Brad for the what is Kubernetes overview. What else do we need to, admin content, setting up a cluster, securing a cluster. This may be less Zach?
I'll take security clusters.
I was about to say that might involve less writing content and more wrangling the SIG responsible, but in your case, I think you could pretty well write the content as well. So if you would like to own that.
Love security. Love to own that. Seriously, I hate the screen lock on my phone, but I lose sleep at night thinking about social security numbers in our company.
Nice. Okay, so Zach Arnold for cluster admin and security. Is there anything else that we haven't covered? That's fair. I will take that on with a note that I will consult out heavily.
Yeah, and I'll be in on the Phil Whitrock's book discussion. I'm part of that.
Sure. Sure.
So from the top level list, there was like release notes
Okay.
And I'm gonna do 10 minutes on the history of it.
Right.
Okay, cool.
So, in the time that we have left, we have how much time? We've got 20 minutes. Let's talk about specific metrics for some of these. I don't know if we're going to get to all of them, but let's talk about specific objectives. Like how will we know whether or not we have achieved a particular task? Like what is the done state for each of these? Some of those that might be difficult to define for some of these like more investigative steps. Like discover more information and report back. But like for Jim.
Sorry to interrupt. I was going to say for the release docs, the target would be easy. The handoff to the 115 team would have a deliverable of a documentation playbook.
So a complete playbook is like that's a really good specific deliverable because right now there's the sort of the sad skeleton of one in SIG community. Raji, how would you like to define, like what are the specific objectives that you want to talk about for accessibility? Like in March, like what is the objective that you would like to set for accessibility? So identifying. So if I'm hearing you right, you would like to have a list of the fundamental accessibility, the fundamental levels of accessibility that we have to address. Like have a prioritized list, if you will, of accessibility issues and things to focus on? Okay. Excellent. So that will look specifically like a set of guidelines for authoring accessible content. And do you also want to cover like site features, like things that we need to address in the site itself, or not so much? Okay. So specific guidelines for authoring accessible content. Excellent. Let's see, Steve. What does a content plan for onboarding look like?
I think it should go in our project. You know how on our website we have projects, and one of the projects is called doc writing and editing. I think the plan should be a list of issues in that project. I get to take charge of. We can get rid of the ones we listed 3 months ago. There are 5 of them there, and put make 5 to 10 of those that are what we actually plan to do in Q1, and they can cover even things like we will create a plan for accessibility. We have that be an issue.
Awesome. So populating our GitHub project for writing and editing with issues for specific content pieces.
Yeah. And
Okay.
so one might be like, okay, we'll have a plan in place, and we'll decide where to put the plan. Maybe we put it in the contributing guide. Another might be, okay, we're going to flesh out a certain area of content, but these are the 2 topics we've decided to write. And so we can be very specific about what we expect to see in the docs at the end of each one.
Excellent. Brad and Andrew, for what is Kubernetes? What is done at the end of Q1 look like?
We definitely need a plan for like what needs to be changed, like what the new thing is going to look like. I think we need to like kind of lay out like what are all the things we need to explain to new people so they have a good foundation of understanding.
Okay, so like a high-level architecture of. Okay, so and will that look like what will that look like? Will that look like
Like the TOC and then like what specific things we're going to need to change.
But it'll be like a document.
Yeah.
Okay, or.
No, I redoing the user journeys is kind of like redoing the homepage, and so that every journey has like a path or set of links.
And would you plan on writing some of those topics during Q1, or are you going to take Q1 to plan and Q2 to write?
I think we should try to write some of them in Q1. I don't think, yeah, it's not going to take 3 months to do the plan.
Okay. So a plan and some meaningful progress in authoring. Okay. So for setup to getting started, Jennifer, Chris, and Cody. Chris, I hear you asking for for specific structure. So Jennifer and Cody, is it reasonable to ask, helping Chris formulate a set of milestones that he can take to SIG Cloud Provider and say, these are the things that SIG Cloud Provider needs to do, or that cloud providers need to do with their content?
We need new information architecture for the whole
Yeah.
thing. And I do, in this case, even though I spoke with caution about starting with information architecture and getting bogged down in design, I think that's definitely, we're set up to getting
Yep.
started, that's where we start.
This is.
There's a fair amount of solid content. Let's work with what we've got
Yep.
first, reorganize it, and then rewrite it.
This is one of the places where information architecture, I think, is supremely important, especially to start.
Thing to do. And that we should be able to deliver. Even if we can't get any of the content rewritten, we should be able to deliver new information architecture implemented on the site by the end of Q1.
Okay.
If we can't do that, we should go back to data.
Okay.
And architecture.
Right, so redoing user journeys. Andrew,
Yeah, I'm going to probably need to hand that off if I can't get it done quickly.
okay. Is there,
Yeah.
yeah, I guess with that I would ask if you think that is work that you have to defer for whatever reason, could your done state maybe be find someone to hand it off to and get the transition done?
Yeah, we just need agreement on the plan, and then have the kind of the design so that then someone knows how to just implement it.
Okay. So Zach, talking about cluster security.
Hi. I have had a mental model of cloud native security is consisting of 4 C's because I like alliterations: code, containers, clusters, and clouds. So I think we could probably safely ignore code and containers, although those probably present a huge risk. If you're deploying someone else's code that you've not even thought about, you could be potentially blowing a hole open in your cluster. So I think this section should probably focus on cluster security, so RBAC-related concepts, authentication mechanisms, potentially some illumination in the authentication, authorization, and mission control process.
So are you thinking of defining this, or are you thinking about going into effective RBAC and understanding RBAC as someone who has no idea what RBAC is?
Yeah, no, well, we actually have a pretty good section on RBAC. That was really helpful.
Thank you, Zach.
Yeah, that was you.
It wasn't me, but I contributed a fair amount to it.
Yeah, because it definitely, it messed with my head the first few to many times I read it. Just because, it's a different, well, it's a similar syntax.
So,
Yes.
yeah, in the interest of time.
No, so that's what I'm trying to say. I actually am trying to crowdsource this decision, which is why I'm thinking
What
about.
about a network security policy?
See, and that's so. Should it just be security concepts that you can implement in your cluster, or should it focus on the components of the cluster that need to be secured, right?
So what I hear you saying is that this sounds like your Q1 goal should be to define these things and define an order and define a prioritized list and then focus on content from there.
Sure, let's go with that. I like that.
Okay.
That sounds much better. Sorry if
No, it's all good.
I'm worried.
Some of us are external processors.
Yeah, I enjoy this.
It's wonderful. Yeah. That's good. All right, so The release playbook. I would like for that to be done. Like we have the goal of that product in Q1 is to have a finished release playbook. I think that the information is there. There's enough pieces of it that it doesn't have to be cut from whole cloth. It can be assembled from various knowledge and like meaningfully, reasonably complete by the end of March, by the end of Q1.
Do we have an ideal location for that? We can take this offline.
I would say the contributing guide. It's a very so currently like contribution is broken out into basic, intermediate, and advanced. I would say expert, but we can add that as we can figure out where it can specifically live in that content hierarchy. But I would say contribution. I do think that the release playbook. We can talk about it offline, but I think that they're in the actual in the community repo. Or in the release repo, there is a requirement for documentation to live there specifically for the release process, like as part of SIG release. But we can cover that, like in the specifics. We get there. All right.
So we mentioned earlier, like the maybe folding in like the content audit stuff into the release process. Do we want to add that to this list or no?
Not for Q1. I would say, like let's focus on having an actual release playbook that then we can iterate on in subsequent quarters. All right.
Zach, just on the release process, I think for Q1, we could make sure that doc generation is totally smooth for the work release.
Yes, I would like to get that. Yes, I want to get that, make those updates while the knowledge and the experience is still fresh with you. But yes, thank you. Thank you for that reminder. So Zach and Steve for, that's me. So I think what done looks like for the information architecture for Philip Whitrock's documentation, I think that looks like a specific decision about where that content lives. Yeah, I have already fairly strong thoughts about that, so I won't belabor the point. Accessibility, we covered that with Raji.
What about like the content lifecycle thing? Is that going to be addressed in Q1?
Content lifecycle.
Well, it includes freshness. A bit more like end-to-end, yeah.
George, do you have an announcement to make?
I hate to interrupt. I need to talk to Andrew for like 5 seconds.
Yep.
Strikes me as a Q2 thing, that freshness.
Sorry?
Strikes me as a Q2.
I agree. I think that yeah, let's focus on what we have on the slate for Q1 already, and then we can prioritize freshness and life cycle, docs life cycle in Q2.
Yeah, I'm adding things that sort of bleed over to Q2 in the Q2 bucket.
Thank you. All right. I think that looks like a reasonably complete list of goals for the year and specific objectives for Q1. Congratulations. So the only thing that we have really left to decide is when we're going to meet again and actually go over this. So without having the calendar in front of me, is there a conference like in March or in April that stands a reasonable chance of us all attending?
Right, the docs is until May 17th.
Right. Yep, KubeCon in Barcelona will be the.
Same time as Write the Docs?
Yeah.
Oh, fuck me.
Yeah. 2 whole weeks later this year with Write the Docs. Alas. Yeah. All right. So if there's no easy either open source summit or KubeCon attached in the first part of the year, I would say let's take lunch to do some investigation, and then maybe like when we gather again at 1 o'clock, let's provide a specific time. If there isn't a specific place, then let's provide a specific date and time where we can meet online to do this again. And I would like to start doing this quarterly because, as has been mentioned, the SIG Docs summit that we did in Portland 6 months ago, that's a different geological strata now in terms of where we are as a SIG and in terms of the life cycle. So I think we need to start doing this quarterly as opposed to like semi-yearly.
I really suggest that we do it remote, that we all like gather online and do it, because I think if we're gonna do it quarterly, we can't really count on there being a conference. I mean, I love seeing all of you, and look forward to the reception later tonight, but if we wanna make this like regular, like doing
Yeah.
it's just,
It also makes it more accessible.
It does.
to the point where we're just checking in on the projects that are going on, if that's like
Yeah.
instead of doing it.
Yep. That sounds reasonable to me. So why don't we commit? How does that sound? Everyone in favor of doing this virtually in 3 months? All right. Then I will take an item to set this up, our next quarterly meeting, and find a date and time and get consensus around that. All right. 5 whole minutes to spare. All right. Thank you, everyone. This is really intense, but we got it done. So.